idea that there's a wonderful line where he says the great Western powers may have given the world an industrial and technological outlook, but it'll come from Africa to give it a more human face, right? He's saying there's something more to what it means to be human than this technological economic determinism.
Welcome to Season 2 of Our Long Walk, a podcast series about South Africa's past, present and future. I'm Johan Fourie from Stellenbosch University, and as always, I'm joined by Wits University's brilliant Jonathan Schoots.
With Johan's expertise in economic history and my expertise in historical sociology, we are excited to interview world-leading academics who ask compelling questions about our country, our continent, and the ideas shaping the world around us. Xolela Mangcu is Professor of Sociology and History and Interim Director of Africana Studies at George Washington University. He has authored a number of books, including biographies of Biko in Biko Alive, as well as a forthcoming biography of Mandela, which is due late 2026. He's also been the editor of a number of books, including Meanings of Mandela and Becoming Worthy Ancestors, amongst a number of others. Xolela has been a fellow at a number of institutes, including Harvard University, MIT, and the Brookings Institute. And Xolela was also my supervisor for my master's and for my PhD. And he's been a really powerful influence on my own thought, on my own intellectual journey. I'm really delighted to have him with us on the podcast. Welcome, Xolela. Lovely to have you here.
Hey, thank you, Jonathan. Good to see you.
So I can jump in with a first question, and maybe I will start quite broadly with some of your older work on Biko, some of your ongoing work on Mandela, and really highlight that what you do is you set political visionaries in this kind of much longer and deeper embedded context. And you have this wonderful quote from Cornel West, where you say that the quality of leadership comes from deeply bred traditions and communities that shape and mold talented and gifted persons. Could you tell us a little bit about what motivates your approach both to biography as a mode of revealing and to the work that you do to situate individuals in this much deeper and longer intellectual history as you do?
Well, I've always been wary of much of the work on leadership in particular, the business school explanations of leadership, the same old stuff, vision, strategy, and all of that. And I've always found that too mechanistic and repetitive. I'm a sociologist first and foremost, and really a social scientist. So I've always thought that you can only understand somebody's biography by tracing it within the history that formed those people, within the institutions that formed those people. And so with Biko, I grew up in the same township in Ginsberg, in King Williamstown, in Eastern Cape. And long before I knew that he was this big deal leader, I followed him around as a little boy, and I was aware that he was someone important, but my frame of mind was always within the context of Ginsberg. So that's how I approached him. What are the institutions in Ginsberg that shaped him? The schools, the social organizations. My family and his family were close friends. My brother was one of his friends. So naturally, the point of departure for me was this kind of historical sociology.
Xolela, maybe I can interject there and ask a little bit about this setting, the Eastern Cape, or we might even push it further in the Transkei. So you've been quite critical, actually, of some of the biographers of Mandela, where you say that they really don't understand, actually, this context very well. They base a lot of what they write on easily accessible records. And then you mentioned something about the Bunga. So I was wondering whether you could tell listeners what the Bunga is and what that tell us about life in the Transkei and perhaps Mandela as well.
Well, I've always been dissatisfied with the existing body of biographies of Mandela. They repeat the same old hackneyed tropes about him being raised by this chief, by the kraal in the village. It's old colonial anthropological stuff. And it's weird because during the course of writing this biography, I've constantly been asked to provide something new and original, which I'm happy to do with this book. But I've always asked myself, how do these guys get published? Because they're repeating the same thing over and over again. So I decided to go into this long journey of the Transkei, where Mandela was born, and looked particularly at the African political modernity of the Transkei and place him within that modernity instead of this traditional tribal history we've had from these almost exclusively white biographers, European and American. I'm the first African to write a biography of Mandela, and I come with that perspective of African political modernity. And the Bunga is critical to that. What happened with the Transkei is that during the wars of conquest, the British and the Cape, the wars had been going on for decades and decades, almost the whole 19th century. And I guess they must have been tired by the end of the century when they reached the Kai River. But more importantly, they were basically scared. If they crossed the Kai River, there were these large kingdoms across the Kai River, and they would just find themselves bogged down fighting with those kingdoms across the Kai River. So they resorted to some kind of indirect rule, and they didn't cross into the Transkei. And they set up this institution called the Transkei Territories General Council, which in Xhosa is Ibunga, the council. And that's how it became known generally among African people in the Transkei. It was some kind of quasi-colonial parliamentary institution. But its importance is that within those limitations, it gave the people of the Transkei an early experience, if you like, with some kind of participation in modern institutions.
So one thing I really like is exactly as you say, okay, instead of making some kind of distinction between Mandela situated between, say, colonial European modernity and some pre-modern Africanness, that you trace those longer histories of kind of the interweaving of a whole set of institutions. But something I think is really interesting that you do there is also willing to overturn this collaborator resistor binary and see a kind of pathway of this African pragmatism that Mandela is emerging into. And so I have this quote here that you say, history thus bequeathed to Mandela a dual legacy of rebellion and cooperation. To present only the former and to hide the latter is to miss the ambiguity of his heritage, how that ambiguity shaped his political instincts. And so you talk a little bit about the kind of Tembu royal family and how they navigated that space, about rebellion in the Tembu context, as well as this form of political actions. Can you tell us a little bit more about navigating that space, pragmatism that emerges in the set of African modern political institutions facing colonialism in the Transkei?
Yeah, the duality is very important in terms of how somebody is formed. Even the traditional modernity living in both of those worlds, right? And, the thing about the collaboration resistant, duality is that it's a function of the fact that we tend to look at history from our contemporary standpoint. There's a concept by Raymond Williams where he speaks about what he calls the structure of feeling, right? Which is this idea that we need to understand history, do as much as we can as it was lived and interpreted by those who lived it, right? Not as something that we look at from our own standpoint and look at it as a finished product, right? It was always evolving. And so those concepts of collaboration are not helpful because that's not how those people were thinking at the time. In fact, the alliances with the whites have happened wherever you've had colonial societies, whether you're looking at the United States in the 18th century, where different Native American groups allied with the colonialists, or you look at different parts of Africa. Remember when the whites came, there were existing rivalries in those places. So they were looking at whites in relation to their respective rivals. And here come these folks with guns and stuff, which would give them an upper hand. So there was this constant and shifting alliances, right? So the pragmatism is it comes out of that historical context, not out of the context that developed in the middle of the 20th century, right? Which is where this notion of collaboration comes in. And when it comes to resistance, again, there's always this ambiguity where African people would participate in colonial institutions and then go back and forth. There's the woman who wrote Ambiguities of Dependence.
Xolela Marx.
Yes, Xolela Marx. She demonstrates that very well in her case studies. So historically, it was not as clear where that line stood. It was always a shifting frontier until, of course, it became impossible as apartheid drew those lines ever starker and starker.
Leila, we've been talking about the 19th century, and what strikes me in speaking to students in many different departments, including history students, is that the 19th century seem incredibly distant. Most students now are interested in the 20th century and sometimes even in the 21st century. They see the early 2000s as deep history. So how would you motivate the students that the 19th century might still be interesting? I mean, some of what you've said already seems like good motivation, but if a student tells you that the 19th century is too far in the past, it doesn't really matter. How would you respond to that?
Well, part of the problem, quite frankly, is that our students are disconnected from their communities and they exist in this virtual world, right? So there are these larger structural issues that shape how they see themselves in relation to their communities. Now, when you're disconnected from your communities, right, there's a certain rupture. There's a certain historical rupture that takes place. How do we get around that? Do what I suggested Jonathan should do when he came to me and said he wanted to do his master's with me. And I said to him, go into the communities. And he did, and he learned Xhosa, and he embedded himself within those communities. That is what we need to do. But I'm also not sure if our universities do enough to foreground African political history, African political modernity. So I think that now the other problem, of course, is that because of the racial history of the academy in South Africa, right? So history has been presented as something out there to be studied and to be chronicled by white professors as something, whereas when it's subjective, that's why I've always been calling for greater and greater African representation in the academy. I'm not saying all African academics would be attuned or interested in this history, but when you have people with that subjective experience who are also academics, I think it makes it likely that students will find them fascinating or interesting one way or another. But, I'm sure there are other pedagogical ways of doing this. That's not my forte, so to speak.
Something that really strikes me about this question of students is, on the one hand, you are talking about, say, for example, how people make an incorrect binary between tradition and modernity with Mandela and then relegate to tradition this Tembu royal lineage. And you show, in fact, the kind of modern engagements there. But something I think is interesting in discussion now is that I think sometimes the language or the framing of decolonization can be a yearning for an escape from the kind of tainting of Western modernity, and that there's a kind of hunger for students to get out of or get away from Western modernity, and that leaves then Africa as this resource of the pre-modern or something like that. And what I think is really interesting, as you show in this Tembu lineage, as you show across your work, even from the early 1800s, there are a series of African intellectuals, thinkers, prophets who are grappling with modernity. And I wonder is there a space to, more confidently assert a lineage of an African intellectual analysis of modernity, even from this long lineage from the 1800s, in South Africa and elsewhere? Or is that itself falling into a tradition modernity binary, right?
Yeah.
Can we say we need to turn to an African analysis of modernity, or is that too much itself falling into the trap?
The concept of decolonization has been, I think, stripped of its original rich interpretations. When the people who were giving this new perspective were not saying, let's rediscover some past that is untainted by colonial modernity. I just pulled up a quote from Frantz Fanon, who's often evoked in these discussions. But let me read out what he said. He says, it is not enough to try to get back to the people in that past out of which they have already emerged. Rather, we must join them in that fluctuating movement, which they are just giving a shape to, and which, as soon as it has started, will be the signal for everything to be called into question. Let there be no mistake about it. It is to this zone of occult instability where the people dwell that we must come. And it is there that our souls are crystallized and that of our perceptions and our lives are transfused with light. I love that quote because Fanon is also often misrepresented by contemporary radicals. So there's never been a moment in our history where people live in this fixed past.
What I see your work doing in many ways is refusing that dichotomy and weaving these pieces together. How do we resist the kind of lure of some outside purity while still saying there is something important that is not foregrounded, say, in the kind of mainline thinkers of Western modernity, that we can have a theorist of African modernity bring something to the analysis that is still necessary, even though it's not somehow outside of the kind of modern context?
It is going to this, what Fanon calls this, zone of occult instability. Okay? We need to learn to be, there's a discomfort, I suppose, with any level of instability. But we must remember that in the colonial and apartheid era, right, there was always this, people were making decisions on the move. They were trying to adapt to different strategies by the oppressors. They didn't have time, right, to pass out what was there in the past. They were living in the present, and living in the present meant that engaging with the ideas around you, contesting those ideas. You can't contest those ideas if you don't know them. If you look at all the political leaders in South Africa, all of them went to British missionary schools, right? Mandela went to Hilltown, Sobukwe went to Hilltown, Biko went to Lovedale, Chisani went to Lovedale. You can go down the list, right? But they used that Western modernity against, they turned it on its head. And that's the experience in all of Africa, right? You have people, Kruma, Nyerere, right? You name them. They were all schooled in these Western modern institutions. But they had this ability, right, to take those ideas and turn them on their head. They had to deal with life as it unfolded in their own time. You know what I mean? It's not like you can extricate yourself from the reality around you. And I think that's part of the problem with much of the discourse of decolonization, at least among those practitioners who have no idea of this historical context.
Maybe on that point, this is also a debate that's been going on for some time now in South Africa. It's not obviously new. We saw pretty violent or large uprisings in 2015 around Rhodes Must Fall. What has changed in the last decade? Has there been movement or change, or are we still in that moment? It feels like South Africa has changed. So firstly, perhaps, why did that happen at that time? And then where are we now, a decade later?
I've not been as much in touch about what is happening now among students in South Africa. What led to that moment? Many of the student leaders, and indeed many of the activists, not only had they not grown up under apartheid, but many of them had gone to private schools with whites and all of that, right? And then they come to the university and they are treated differently from their own high school mates, right? And so the promise, and by the way, this has happened with almost all liberation movements, this contradiction between the promise, right, of acceptance into quote unquote civilization, right? And then the barriers that are put into that, right? And this what leads many movements, including the ANC Youth League. You have these highly educated guys, they are promised this Victorian future and becoming part of this Western culture, but then there are barriers put into that. There's an analog between those experiences and I think what happened in South Africa with Rhodes Must Fall is that these young people realize that they began to experience racism directly in ways that they had never done in high school or in their fairly privileged backgrounds, some of them. And then you had, on the other hand, those students who came from poor backgrounds. And so there was this alliance, like you've had in the past, also in the liberation movement. So they all came together. So I was part of that. I think I was the first professor at UCT to join with these students. But I must say that I became very disappointed by the way that by the failed promise of the movement. I mean, with somebody like Steve Biko in the late 1960s and early 70s, they were able to build political intellectual movement, also tied to community development. And I had been saying to the students, you need to develop something along those lines. But I guess they were too radical for me, or I was too much of a moderate for them. But then you had a situation where they would, God, that was so embarrassing, where they shouted down Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the University of Cape Town. You know, what irony. This is the founder of decolonization, all right? One of the founders of decolonization. And they had no clue who he was. They shouted him down, and that's when I became really disenchanted and left and decided, I don't want to be part of this vulgarity, quite frankly.
You have always, on the one hand, engaged in this kind of present day, engaged social and political analysis, kind of public intellectual engagements. And also, your work is always kind of weaving the tools of biography and the tools of history. And so I wanted to ask, how do you think about biography and history as a vehicle for social analysis? And how do you think about weaving together the work that you do of situating these individuals and their thoughts as well as their histories to do a better analysis of the present, a better sociology? How do you intermingle those two roles, those two hats?
I've always, for whatever reason, I've always been intrigued by, initially, right, the kind of like great man theory of leadership. I was always, as a child, intrigued by people like Biko and the history of my family in the 19th century, right? So there's a biographical and autobiographical aspect to this. And so I've always had that fascination. And then, of course, it's extended to people like Mandela and others. I think it's a major shortcoming of leadership studies or analysis that we don't have the biographies of the people we elect. And, I'm not saying there must be a vetting process that we must look at somebody's psychological past deeply and qualify or disqualify them. Because, people are always ever evolving, right? But it would be nice to have some kind of biographical approach. We might have been spared of some of these leaders we've had, quite frankly, right? And that can be done by leaders writing their life stories, writing books, being interrogated by the media. So when I started doing my public writing, I was bringing that whole interest in who is this person? Where do they come from? What motivates them? And I think it's made it easier for me to take a step back and bring that historical biography to analysis of contemporary politics. But it requires, quite frankly, also to be quick on your feet, because I was writing weekly newspaper columns for 8 years without missing a week. So you're also not going back into history and trying to understand the details and the minutiae of their biographies. So there's a certain facility you have to have, and I don't know how you teach that or you develop that. It's part of your experience.
I guess that's a great segue to a question about our current leader, because I'm going to quote one of the things that you wrote in 2018. We'll share a link to that. And you wrote, Ramaphosa will have to redefine the presidency. Over the past 25 years, we have labored under a technocratic view of presidential leadership. In this view, the role of the president is to lead the government in developing policies that will grow the economy, create jobs, and fight poverty and inequality. However, even more important than this is restoring public trust, without which there can be no business investment, no educational achievement, and no common national purpose that transcends group and individual self-interest. So my question is plain and simple. Do you think Ramaphosa in 2026 has achieved that? And, why or why not?
It's cut from the same cloth as the guys who've come before. Biography again, in this case, the institutional biography of the ANC. They've never really had this cultural, historical sociology, if you like, or politics, right? It was about marches on the streets, the armed struggle, and then the materialist analysis of the communists and the liberals. What distinguishes Biko is this idea that there's a wonderful line where he says the great Western powers may have given the world an industrial and technological outlook, right? But it'll come from Africa to give it a more human face, right? So what he's doing there, he's saying there's something more to what it means to be human than this technological economic determinism that is dominating. So the ANC has never gotten out of that, and this idea of service delivery and economic growth, as if those things can be achieved outside of this cultural value system. The economy is a cultural institution, a set of cultural institutions based on trust, right? And if I buy something from you, you expect me to pay for it, and I expect you to give it to me. That's a fundamental, that's not an economic concept. That's a fundamental cultural value. Okay. Societies that don't have that, there's somebody called Douglas C. North who articulated this concept, right? But there are many other figures who've articulated this concept. A leader has to articulate those antecedent values, right? Remember, when you are in, let's say you're giving the State of the Nation address, right? You don't want to bore people with all these little details about cutting a borehole there and all of that. You have an opportunity to address the nation and where they can actually connect with you. And that is at the moral, cultural level. And then everything else follows. But when you don't have that, then you have people stealing all over the place because of this lack of cultural and moral values at the political level.
Maybe for the listeners, just to say that we joked before and that appearing on our Long Walk podcast leads to a Nobel, and we spoke about James Robinson being here, but that's exactly kind of James's most recent work says exactly as you've just said, Xolela. So maybe I should have nominated you to the Nobel, because this is exactly what he's saying, is that within Africa at least we should think much harder about these kind of cultural values and norms. And obviously his work historically is how colonialism often basically just completely destroyed many of these systems of trust. And Leonard Wanchikon's work shows that for slavery.
Yeah, maybe they should establish a Nobel for the social sciences and the humanities. Another person who did a fantastic job at this is, of course, Karl Polanyi in his wonderful book, The Great Transformation, where, again, he explains the colonial assault, right, on the basic institutions of the people, right? in which everything else happens. And that's what we've done, ironically, in the post-colonial period, is just decimate the institutions that gave meaning to our people, or that allowed our people to self-organize, the schools. So it's been a hemorrhaging of our own making, quite frankly.
I have so many questions on this, but let me pick one thread out of what you've said. One thing that you pointed to there is an ANC kind of lineage compared to something that Biko brought into this analysis. And this kind of reminded me of a discussion that you've had in the past. I'm thinking here between the kind of non-racialism of Mandela and the Black consciousness of Biko. And now, a little while ago, in a book, The Color of Our Future, you have this piece titled, What Can Moving Beyond Race Actually Mean? Towards a Joint Culture. And there you think with non-racialism and Black consciousness. And you have this interesting piece where you talk about race transcendent leadership as a vision for a way forward, and goes joint culture. So you use Cornel West's framing here, or you at least draw on it, where there are race effaces, race identifying, and then race transcendent kinds of thinking. And with that, maybe as a launching off point, but maybe even more to where your thought stands now, is you've worked closely with the thought of Biko, you've worked closely with Mandela, and you've done a lot of work thinking about race in South Africa and also ways forward. What do you think at this intersection of these lineages that we can draw from to maybe get towards race transcendent leadership? And where do you stand now on the future for South Africa in this direction?
Before I get to that, let me make this other point. The ANC, from when it was started, right, it did have actually these values. And these values were actually liberal values. The ANC had adopted a Bill of Rights in 1923, right? And then, of course, the document called the African Claims in 1943, right? Articulating these liberal rights, the right to property, the right to speech, classic liberal values. But then that kind of disappeared in the post-war period. Coming to this issue of leadership, race transcendence does not mean race denial. It does not mean race disappearance, right? The very concept of transcendent actually means that you recognize something, but you go beyond that something in then developing a new synthesis. And that's exactly what Biko meant by the joint culture, right? We have something as Black people, with the majority after all, right? We have something to bring to the table and remake the table, not just join the table, but completely remake it. And you can't remake it without a sense of your own identity, your own cultural values, and where you, okay? And he says quite explicitly that this doesn't mean doing away with European culture. And he writes that in his book, in a chapter, I think, called On Some African Cultural Concepts. And he writes about how culture is never static. Sometimes I think the people who carry the Biko flag have not read Biko. They just haven't. And I've seen that over and over. They have no idea of who he was. So they get shocked when you say, Biko had these white friends, Alred Stubbs, Donald Woods, Francis Wilson. He had these white girlfriends, Paula Enso, and all of these people, right? But he was not someone who was this fire-breathing, anti-white individual. But he was rejecting the notion of white supremacy and white cultural values as a barometer for society. So do we go then with this idea of a joint culture? Or of a race transcendent leadership? I don't know if we have the leadership in the first place to articulate that kind of vision. That's a more fundamental problem. We don't have it in the ANC. We don't have it. Yeah. So I don't know how we can bring that around. You would need a transcendent figure. We're not going to get another Nelson Mandela, but you do need a leadership with that kind of intellectual sophistication, quite frankly.
I want to jump in here on the topic of race. because you've edited a book on Black economic empowerment. So I just want to ask about the original vision of BEE. I think it's evolved in people's perception of what it is. And I think the initial idea of it has been lost. But given that vision, do you think it's been a success? And again, why or why not?
BE was an Anglo-American project. Okay, it was their own attempt to co-opt a black elite, if business elite, and it comes, of course, at the height of the struggle, right? And when people like Gavin Raleigh, who was the head of Anglo-American, begin to have these meetings with ANC and with civil society, what begins to happen is there are these networks that are formed. And if you've been in the bush or you've been in the township and you're sitting with the head of Anglo, the whole thing becomes so attractive, right? That even if you get a little crumbs from the table, you instantly become a millionaire, right? Or a billionaire for that matter. So that is its origin story. What's shameful is that the ANC was unable, like we've done in our struggle with many things, even education, failed to rearticulate that, failed to give it new meaning, right, beyond its own cadres. So BE became an ANC cadre patronage system. That's just the truth. And that's why it has failed to reach the broad masses of African people. It's an ANC self-enrichment project. That's what it is, if we're going to be honest about it.
You've got a recent piece where you talk about different forms of solidarity. And this in some ways comes back to your discussion of Polanyi. And there you talk about histories of nationalism often emerging out of discontent, but you also talk about economic protectionism, and you trace this, on the one hand, a kind of global and transnational white solidarity, as well as a racial nationalism, a kind of white nationalism that emerges in this kind of protectionist mode. So one thing I think is really interesting there is you highlight discontent and economic root causes, economic kind of fear as a base for aggressive nationalism that excludes. And at the end of that piece, you talk about a different kind of political cosmopolitanism. And I'm going to quote here: "We are going to have to develop new kinds of leadership and solidarity networks, vertically between local, national, and global institutions, and horizontally across national, race, ethnic, class, and gender-based identities." So I wonder, out of looking at this piece, where do you see these new kinds of, I don't know, aggressive, exclusionary, I don't know, nationalist identities coming from? And where do you see the seeds of something else, of this kind of political cosmopolitanism? Are there places in the US or in South Africa where these things are beginning to flourish that could be, I don't know, encouraged in whatever ways? Is there a latent future there, perhaps, that you could point to?
Yeah, this is a piece that appeared in Transition magazine out of Harvard University. George Fredrickson uses a metaphor of this bird that feeds on dead carcasses to describe racism. Racism lives on dead ideas, and what it does is it takes those ideas and refurnishes them, and even if it's not exactly the same thing, to understand the current moment. You would be forgiven for thinking that we're living in the late 19th century, where in the aftermath of the Civil War in the United States, during Reconstruction, where you have Black people occupying political positions, going to Congress, and all of that, then you have this backlash, right, from, interestingly, before you have the Ku Klux Klan and all those white supremacist organizations, you have this backlash, this racist backlash, but it comes from intellectuals. It comes from intellectuals and journalists in the South of the United States. And in Britain, of course, this idea of white man's countries, Australia, America, Britain. But what gives fuel to this fire, if you like, is the breakdown of the global economic system in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And you have those racist white solidarities that have been built become the basis for the dissatisfaction with the economic conditions that I imagine, right? So you have these white nationalists riding on this economic dislocation caused by globalization to fuel the rise of fascism. That's how Mussolini rises to power, on this notion of economic dissatisfaction among whites. You see something similar today, where in the United States, this discourse now of anti-immigrant, the immigrant who is now hated now, right? It's Latinos for the most part coming from the southern border, right? Back in the day, it was the Chinese. So history has got a way of repeating itself, right? If, what did Marx say, the first time as tragedy and the second time as farce, right? You have a lot of farce going around here, but it's a tragic farce. So how do we get out of that, right? How do we get out of that? Let's look at how folks back then got out of it. It really took Roosevelt in the United States to pull America from that America first, nationalistic, isolationist racism, right? And Roosevelt, who pretty much builds his relationships. And that's contrary to what you see now with Trump, right? With Roosevelt, you see this building of NATO, building of multinational alliances. Just like I said earlier on, that we don't have a Mandela, right, to fix South Africa. We don't have a Roosevelt, right? We don't have a Martin Luther King Jr. now to articulate this vision. Will such leadership emerge? There's a lovely quote by Eric Hobsbawm, the historian, where he uses a metaphor that that you may be expecting a visitor to come knocking on your door, but you cannot put a face to that visitor. You know the visitor is going to come, but you can't anticipate how they're going to look. So there will emerge a new leadership. It may be long after we're gone, but that's how history rolls. What's important is for us to create in South Africa and around the world a bank of ideas. You know what I mean? A bank of ideas where those leaders, from which those leaders can draw. And that's one of the sad things about South Africa, is that as soon as I came back to South Africa after graduate school in the 1990s, I was saying build intellectual institutions, Black intellectual institutions. And of course, that never happened. And I blame Thabo Mbeki for that. Started a good promise of something called the African Renaissance, but ended up surrounding himself with sycophants. That's just another tragedy of our situation. So globally, Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, made a really great speech about the contradictions of globalism right now. Again, where that will take us, I don't know. But the important thing is to build a set of prefigurative ideas, to use a concept you used, that future generations can draw upon.
I really like this idea of a repository of ideas or a bank of ideas. One person who has, of course, endowed us with some ideas is, in fact, you, Xolela. So I used some of those ideas, and using AI tools, ChatGPT and Suno, I turned that into a song. So that's part of the tradition on the Our Long Walk podcast, is I'm going to play you a song based on your most recent work. So let's go.
Praise to the paper that walks like a chief in the mist, to the argument that does not fear the hard road. It calls solidarity by its true name, not as sweetness only, but as a force that can build a home or burn it. It remembers how men were taught to belong by excluding, how unity can be a shield or a sharpened spear. Solidarity can save, solidarity can scar. It can lift you to the light or leave you where the shadows are. Praise to the author, the one with ink on his hands, the reader of archives, the listener to old songs in new mouths. He carries names like drums and measures their rhythm. He sees the farce hiding inside the tragedy. He refuses easy innocence. He refuses cheap blame. He brings back clarity. not comfort. Solidarity can save, solidarity can scar. It can lift you to the light or leave you where the shadows are. Our praise to the maker of crossings, the builder of meeting places. When institutions creak and the town grows tired, he does not shout from rooftops. He gathers voices in a circle. He says we are not trapped in what we inherit. We can choose a solidarity that binds without choking, a rope of many hands pulling towards a shared tomorrow. Solidarity can save, solidarity can scar. It can lift you to the light or leave you where the shadows are. Solidarity can save, solidarity can scar. It can lift you to the light or leave you where the shadows are.
Wow, that's amazing. How did you do this?
It's basically using your paper and asking ChatGPT. I asked it specifically for a Xhosa praise singer, and so it gave me the text, and then I added into a website called Suno. In this case, I asked for some traditional African musical elements, and so that's what it produced.
Whoa, damn, that's amazing. I've never been a big fan of AI. You might have persuaded me. Thank you, guys. Yeah.
The final thing, Xolela, that we do is to ask ChatGPT for a quirky question to ask our interviewer. It's come up with what I think is quite an interesting question. Do you think South Africa suffers more from a crisis of imagination or a crisis of execution?
It's a crisis of imagination. South Africa suffers deeply from a crisis of imagination, without question.
I expected that answer. Thank you very much, Xolela.
Wow, guys.
Yeah, Xolela, it's been so wonderful to have you on with us. So wonderful to have this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Our Long Walk podcast. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with the next episode. Goodbye. Thank you for listening to another episode of Season 2 of the Our Long Walk podcast. We'd love to hear from you. What's the one idea from today's conversation that changed your outlook? Do you have a burning question you'd like to explore, or perhaps a guest you'd love to hear from? Get in touch with us by sending an email to johan@ourlongwalk.com. That's JOHAN@ourlongwalk.com.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. You can follow us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we'd love your feedback. Visit us at ourlongwalk.com. Follow our LinkedIn page for updates, new episodes, and additional links.
This series is made possible by the Chair in Economics, History and Policy at Stellenbosch University. Visit leapstellenbosch.org for more information about our research unit in economic history.
Thanks to Leap researcher Kelsey Lemon, who provided helpful background research. Thanks also to the team at Voice Note Productions for helping to make this podcast. Our producer is Vasti Calitz. Sound design and editing is done by Andri Burnett. Nkosi Johan.
Dankie, Jonathan. Join us next time for another episode of Our Long Walk.
See you then.
Cheers.